They said I was slowing things down. Funny thing is, after I left, nothing moved at all. My name is Victor Miguel Salas, 46. Former vendor compliance officer for ClearSpan Defense Systems. For 6 years, I was the person who made sure our supply chain didn't just deliver, but held. I didn't sign off because it was routine. I signed off because I knew who I was signing for. And 2 months ago, they walked me out of the building like I'd forgotten how the system worked. It was a Tuesday, the kind with gray light and good coffee. I'd just finished a vendor audit report that took me 6 weeks documenting a chain of subcontractor certifications across 4 states. It was clean, bulletproof, ready for federal review. Then I got the calendar invite. Subject line, Realignment Briefing, 20 minutes. No location, just a meeting room number I'd never seen used before. When I stepped inside, the CTO and a junior HR rep were already waiting. The rep didn't even know how to look at me. The CTO smiled like he'd already practiced it. "Victor," he said, "we're restructuring to better align with growth priorities. Compliance will be transitioning to a lighter, more agile model." I didn't interrupt. I already knew. He continued. "We've brought in someone from McKinsey who's built vendor networks for commercial tech. Faster turnaround, leaner risk models." The HR rep slid an envelope across the table. "You've done great work, Victor. Truly. But we're moving toward digitized oversight, automated escalation. This isn't about performance, it's about evolution." I opened the envelope. 2 weeks severance. An NDA I'd already read versions of 100 times. They hadn't even updated the template to include defense clearance revocation procedures. Sloppy. I folded the paper, stood up, and said what I've always said when someone thinks a shortcut can replace process. "I get it." No protest, no panic, just an internal note. They don't know what they just touched. I walked back to my office, boxed up 3 things. My badge, a laminated copy of the first vendor license I ever signed, and a blue notebook with a frayed spine. That notebook had every vendor I'd ever approved by hand. Not because the system required it, but because names mean something when you're dealing with parts that keep jets from falling out of the sky. Nobody said goodbye. But as I walked out, I saw the new guy Jordan something standing by the elevator in a blazer too tight for his shoulders, practicing lines like, "We're pivoting towards strategic procurement enablement." The kind of language that collapses under the weight of a failed audit. I didn't leave angry. I left aware of how many vendors had trusted me, not the company. People like Thomas at Ferrotech in El Paso, who built radar housing components on 3-day cycles because I vouched for his thermal testing. People who didn't speak in deliverables or metrics. People who sent me photos of their workers eating lunch in the break room I helped them afford. And now those same vendors were about to be streamlined. The new guy would inherit a list. What he wouldn't inherit was the network. Because a list isn't a relationship. A dashboard isn't trust. 3 days after I left, I got a text from an old vendor. "Just got notice from the DoD portal license listed as pending again." Did something change? I didn't answer. But I logged into the public-facing contractor registry. Sure enough, 5 vendors I had personally certified had reverted to inactive. No public reason, no error code, just a line license pending signature. Salas Vendor Compliance. The clause I'd embedded 3 years ago, clause 7.4, was never designed to trap anyone. It was written after a smaller vendor I'd once trusted got blacklisted because a new manager skipped a background trace on a subcontractor. Clause 7.4 ensured that no vendor in a critical supply chain could be verified federally unless the approving officer of record revalidated any high-risk replacements. It wasn't a power play. It was protection. For the vendors, for the program, for the system. They removed me. But they forgot I didn't leave the system. I wrote it. I spent the next week doing nothing. No retaliation, no alerts. I cleaned my garage, I went fishing, but each morning I checked the dashboard I'd helped design. And each time I saw another red flag blinking in the corner. Faint. Easy to ignore, but real. System notice license integrity chain incomplete. Missing signature authority. Salas, vendor compliance. I didn't say a word, because sometimes the most honest thing you can do is say nothing. Just let the system speak, and trust that someday someone will hear what it's been trying to say. If you've ever seen someone discarded for being too careful, hit that subscribe button. Not for me, for them, the ones who kept things from breaking until someone called them too slow to innovate. When people think about compliance, they think of checklists. Boxes to tick, PDFs to sign. What they don't think about is silence. The silence between a request submitted and a signature given. That space, that pause, is where trust is built. Or broken. Most people move past it. I stayed inside it. Back when I was still with ClearSpan, my desk sat in a narrow room off the main corridor. No windows, just the low hum of the license servers behind the wall. Most people hated that room. Said it felt like the inside of a filing cabinet. To me, it was quiet enough to think. That's where I ran every vendor trace. Not from the automated queue, but from the beginning manufacturer sub shipping trail origin cert material composition, down to the hands. If I didn't know who physically touched the part going into a reconnaissance drone, I didn't sign. That wasn't paranoia. That was memory. I remember a case 2 years ago, vendor out of Arizona. On paper they passed. ISO certified. Traceability logs matched the database. Even had glowing reviews from our own Tier 1 supplier. But something felt off. The welding pattern on the scan report looked too uniform, too perfect for handwork. So I called, not the project manager, the shop foreman. He didn't answer on the first try, or the second. Finally picked up around 6:20 a.m. Yeah, he said groggy, "This is Angelo." I introduced myself. Said I wasn't calling to flag anything, just needed to understand who did the last weld run on the casing shipment. He paused. "That was Sal," he said finally. "He left 2 months ago." "Who's doing it now?" "Machine job now. We had to speed things up for the new contract." I closed my laptop, typed a single note in the ledger vendor trace void. Process shift unreported. That was enough. We didn't blacklist them. I just didn't approve the expansion. No alert, no fallout, just silence. And the casing never made it into our program. I did that more times than anyone knew. The vendors who never made it through weren't always frauds. Sometimes they just weren't ready. Sometimes they were brilliant, precise, honest shops, but missing a signature on a calibration cert from 2006. And sometimes they were brilliant, precise, honest shops, but had managers who cut corners when no one was looking. My job wasn't to guess who they were. It was to find out. People thought I was slow because I didn't trust automation. That's not true. I didn't trust people who designed automation without understanding what it replaced. There's a difference. You can't quantify hesitation. You can't put a timestamp on a gut feeling. But if you've ever held a part in your hand and known something wasn't right, even when every metric said it was, you understand why some of us still pick up the phone. I kept a physical notebook because the system didn't store everything I needed. The system tracked vendors by number, by tier, by region. But I tracked by names. Page after page. Ferrotech, El Paso, Thomas G. First to deliver under 3-day cycle. Never missed a QA window. Wife just beat cancer rebuilding operations. Sandpoint Precision, Idaho. Margie T flagged once in 2019, sub-vendor failed torque test. Margie called me directly before audit hit. These weren't just entries. They were context. They were why I didn't approve by template. You don't flag someone like Thomas because a shipping timestamp is off by 12 minutes. You call. You ask. And if you've built the kind of relationship worth keeping, he tells you what happened before you even ask. That's not inefficiency, that's resilience. Once a VP pulled me into a metrics meeting. He pointed at a slide showing my average approval window 14.2 days. The company target was 9. "Victor," he said, "we can't scale at this speed." I said, "How fast do you want to fail?" He didn't laugh. I wasn't the fastest, but none of the vendors I cleared had ever caused a compliance incident. Not one. And that meant something. At least, I thought it did. After I was gone, they replaced the vendor protocol with something they called Trust Light, a framework built to accelerate partnerships and empower automation. It sounded clean, strategic, aligned, but there's no checkbox for whether a foreman knows his staff. No drop-down for whether the guy who assembles sensor mounts cares what the drone's used for. Those are the things I used to listen for. In the silence, between approval and release. And now that silence was gone, replaced by noise. Most people never read the compliance language. They skim it, or they trust that someone else already did. Clause 7.4 sat near the bottom of every vendor approval agreement. Right after the section on indemnification, and just before the page everyone signs without reading. It didn't look dramatic, just a few lines of legalese about license continuity and authority validation. But it was the most important thing I ever wrote. Clause 7.4 was born out of a mistake. Not mine, but one I watched unfold in real time. 4 years ago, a new executive signed off on a batch of component vendors without routing it through me. Said the timeline was tight. Said we needed to trust the process. 2 weeks later, one of those vendors was flagged by the Defense Logistics Agency for counterfeit alloy usage. Not fraudulent, just misclassified. But it was enough to trigger a full audit. We almost lost the whole contract. And I remember sitting in a windowless room with 2 compliance officers from the Air Force and 1 procurement lawyer who couldn't stop sweating. They kept asking the same question: who signed the last verified trace? No one could answer. Because it wasn't me. And because the system allowed it. After that, I rewrote the framework. Clause 7.4 made one thing clear. All critical path vendor approvals must be countersigned by the original compliance officer of record. In the event of personnel transition, written transfer of authority must be registered in the vendor chain log and acknowledged by both outgoing and incoming officers. Absence of this signature will render vendor status unverified for federal license purposes. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't scalable, but it worked. They let me keep it because it didn't slow things down until someone tried to skip a step. It was a quiet failsafe, not a trap, a tether. I remember the first time it activated on its own. A supplier out of Oregon was onboarding for a component used in field surveillance units. All approvals had gone through. Everyone signed off, except one signature was missing in the chain log. Mine. The system rejected the vendor automatically, flagged them as inactive. People thought it was a bug. They opened a ticket with IT. It took them half a day to realize Clause 7.4 had caught the break. Someone had tried to reintroduce a vendor previously removed for failing a materials test. They thought the records had been purged. They weren't. That's when legal finally read it. All of it. They didn't thank me. Just told me to make sure that doesn't happen again. I remember closing my screen, running my hand over the frayed edge of my notebook, writing down one sentence. Systems don't remember. People do. Clause 7.4 was the memory I gave the system. A way to make sure it didn't forget how things were supposed to be done when I was gone. I never told anyone this, but when I designed that clause, I added a line of metadata to the logs. Not for enforcement, just for clarity. Whenever a vendor failed due to Clause 7.4, the system would generate a status note. License void, authority missing, SAILA's vendor compliance. Most people never saw it. It didn't show up in the interface, only in the raw log export. But it was there, a fingerprint, a quiet way of saying someone used to care. The irony, of course, is that Clause 7.4 didn't fire the day I left. It waited. Because nothing technically changed until someone tried to change the network. They assumed I was gone. They assumed the clause was dead code. They didn't read it. Didn't realize that unless they formally reassigned authority, the entire chain remained tied to me. 2 weeks after I left, I checked the public vendor ledger again. 7 vendors had reverted to pending. 3 of them had active defense contracts in fulfillment stage. One of them was set to deliver custom insulation sleeves for a mid-range UAV program. Without verification, they couldn't ship. And unless someone reactivated authority, nothing would move. I know what you're thinking. Why didn't I warn them? Why didn't I send an email or flag the clause or help them transfer it properly? Because I already had. 3 months before I was let go, I submitted a memo during a documentation audit. Ensure all compliance transitions include Clause 7.4 review and assignment. Failure to do so will result in system-level vendor deactivation. Nobody followed up, no one asked questions, and when the system responded exactly as it was designed to, they assumed it broke. It didn't break. It remembered. Clause 7.4 was never about control. It was about weight. The weight of responsibility. The kind that doesn't show up in reports or spreadsheets. The kind you carry in silence because systems don't carry it for you. It didn't start with alarms. There was no breach, no red blinking light, no call from Washington. It started with a timestamp. One of the vendors, SPE Aero, out of Pennsylvania, sent a shipment status update to the central system. The file bounced. Clearance ID not found. They tried again, same result. So they emailed someone in procurement. That person forwarded it to operations. Operations flagged it for IT. IT opened a ticket. Category API mismatch, vendor profile authentication error, priority medium. What they didn't realize was that SPE Aero hadn't changed anything. Their profile was clean. Credentials valid. Chain of custody intact. The only thing missing was me. Their license authority had expired when I left. Clause 7.4 had done exactly what it was supposed to do, freeze the vendor chain until someone reassigned compliance authority. But nobody knew that. They didn't read the logs. They read the interface. And the interface just said ID not found. By day 3, 2 more vendors experienced the same issue. One in Missouri, one in San Diego. Both quietly dropped from active to pending. No alerts, just status drift. I watched it unfold from my personal terminal. Still had read-only access to the federal ledger. I didn't call anyone, didn't send a warning. I just logged the entries in my notebook. I marked them by hand. Not by company, by name. Elisa R. S.P. Aero, Martin H. Sienna Composites, Nguyen L. West Flight. People I'd spoken with. People I'd cleared personally. People now floating in a system that didn't recognize them anymore. I kept thinking maybe they'll catch it. Maybe someone will trace it back. Maybe the CTO will finally open the documentation folder labeled Legacy Approvals. But they didn't. Instead, they called another meeting. This one about decentralized partner onboarding. The slide deck included terms like auto-validation protocol and flexible compliance windows. They had no idea the system was already rejecting vendors in silence. Some of the rejections came during off hours. One vendor got flagged at 2:43 a.m., another at 5:19. Automated system checks running in the background, checking, failing, pausing, then waiting. Like the system was asking, where's the person who used to say yes? By the end of the second week, the vendor count had dropped by 7%. Still no alarm. Still no one asking questions. The dashboard didn't show failure. It showed stillness. No incoming approvals. No outgoing confirmations. Just nothing. I remember sitting at my kitchen table on a Friday night scrolling through the chain logs. Coffee gone cold. Notebook open. The system wasn't crashing. It was holding its breath. Waiting for a voice it used to trust. I did get one email. From a vendor I hadn't heard from in years. Hey Victor, don't know if you're still involved, but we're getting bounced by ClearSpan. Any chance you can check if our file's still clean? I didn't respond. Not because I didn't want to. Because I didn't know how to explain that it wasn't about their file. It was about absence. About what happens when the person who built the chain is no longer holding it together. I did write one thing, though, in my notebook. Beneath a growing list of names I wrote, "System isn't broken. It's looking for someone who remembers." 3 days later, I caught something new in the log. An error I hadn't seen before. Vendor trace invalidated. Chain authority expired. No red flag, no escalation. Just a line of black text in a sea of white. But I knew what it meant. The system wasn't just pausing approvals now. It was retracting trust. The funny thing is, everyone thought compliance was friction. Something you build around speed. What they forgot is that speed only matters when you're moving in the right direction. And once you lose trust, you don't just slow down, you stop. It was a small delay. 4 hours. Enough to shift a delivery window. Enough to make someone nervous. The vendor was Linton Dynamics Tier 1 supplier for a reconnaissance platform under live field testing. They had been set to ship a final batch of carbon-infused actuator casings. Custom spec, temperature rated. Cleared through my desk 6 times over the last 4 years. Only this time the confirmation didn't come through. The system flagged their file. Verification expired. No error code, no explanation, just a quiet shift from green to gray. They emailed operations. Operations kicked it to compliance. Compliance couldn't access the clearance chain. That's when someone said it. Do we even know who signed this vendor last? Silence. Then someone opened an old spreadsheet, scrolled, paused. Then came the words that would echo again and again over the next 2 weeks. It looks like Salas. They sent a request to IT, asked if I still had backend permissions. I didn't. They checked the vendor profile. Clause 7.4 triggered again. System log entry vendor approval loop invalid. Salas vendor compliance missing from signature path. No override available. That's when they called legal. Legal asked if the clause could be reversed post facto. It couldn't. Reversal would invalidate the contract terms with the Department of Defense. Procurement drafted a waiver request. The DoD declined. Too close to live testing. By Friday, the shipment deadline had passed. The actuator batch sat in a warehouse in Kansas. No fault. No failure. Just missing a name. Mine. I didn't learn about it from the company. I learned from the vendor. Someone I used to work with sent me a message. No ask. Just one sentence. They're calling us non-compliant now, after all we did. I didn't reply. Didn't know how to explain that it wasn't personal. The system wasn't punishing them. It was protecting itself. I opened the dashboard again that night. 7 vendors now in suspended state. 2 of them flagged by external agencies as approval authority unclear. I scrolled down to the one that mattered most. Linton Dynamics. Status frozen. I knew what that meant. If one more vendor in that supply chain failed to validate, the entire project would be moved to review, which meant the program might miss federal performance deadlines, which meant someone at ClearSpan would finally have to answer a question they'd been dodging for weeks. Who holds the keys? I flipped back to an old page in my notebook. Linton Dynamics handwritten note. Sal F., lead engineer. Turned down a larger contract because he believed in our specs. Delivered 4 days early, twice. That wasn't something the system tracked. But I did. And now he was sitting on $1 million shipment the system wouldn't touch. Somewhere inside ClearSpan, people were pointing fingers. I could feel it in the logs. Frantic attempts to validate alternate compliance signers. Failed. Attempts to push emergency license reassignments. Clause 7.4 blocked them. Because that clause didn't care who panicked. It only cared about what was real. And unless someone transferred authority correctly, the system refused to pretend otherwise. Later that weekend, I saw a memo posted internally, accidentally forwarded to my old address by someone who hadn't updated their contacts. The subject line, vendor gridlock escalation, Salas. No greeting, no context. Just the body of the message. Can someone explain how we became dependent on a single signature to operate 68% of our external supply chain? More importantly, who thought it was a good idea to let him leave without a succession plan? Is there any legal workaround? This is not sustainable. I read it twice, then closed my screen. It wasn't pride. It wasn't vindication. It was quiet. The kind of quiet that comes when something designed for protection is finally doing its job. Not against people, but against forgetfulness. People think systems fail when they're broken. But sometimes, systems fail when they remember what everyone else forgot. That trust has a signature. And that every deal, not just the contracts, but the people behind them, still needs someone who stands behind the yes. The first real meeting happened on a Thursday. Not because of the missed shipments or the vendor lockouts, but because the quarterly board report was due in 2 days, and no one could explain why 68% of the supply chain was sitting in limbo. It started as a metrics check-in. By the end, it was labeled Emergency Systems Brief. The CEO called in the CTO, the head of legal, and 2 people from procurement. All on mute except for one guy flipping through a spreadsheet and saying, "We've lost access to a critical number of verified vendors. We think it's tied to legacy protocol gating, possibly tied to compliance transition." They didn't use my name. Not yet. The CTO proposed a manual override. "We just need temporary clearance to push approvals through while we audit the vendor chain." Legal shook her head. Clause 7.4 doesn't allow that. Any override would constitute trace tampering, which violates federal licensing integrity. The CEO leaned in. "So you're telling me Our system refuses to approve vendors because we lost track of who used to do it. Silence. Procurement tried to deflect. We've been told the original signatory was Salas, but the logs are obscure. We can't find the actual handoff record. The CTO looked annoyed. We don't do handoff records anymore. That was an old model. Legal just sighed. It's not about the model. It's about the clause. The system still recognizes him as the last verified compliance authority, which means no Salas, no signature, no signature, no license. The CEO closed his laptop halfway, spoke without raising his voice. Has anyone spoken to him? More silence. We let him go 6 weeks ago, someone mumbled. There wasn't a reason to loop him back in. The CEO nodded once, then said the quiet part out loud. So we cut the guy who built the fence, and now we're surprised the gate won't open. They tried anyway. The next 48 hours were a carousel of bad decisions. They asked IT to inject provisional credentials. The system denied it. Override request failed. Chain integrity compromised. They tried to generate a ghost signature. The system flagged it. Trace anomaly detected. Salas vendor compliance authority not transferable. They blamed the vendors. Said they were withholding delivery for leverage. But the vendors had already replied. Their files were clean. Their parts were ready. They just couldn't ship. By Sunday night, someone finally reached out to me. Not a call, not a formal message, just a forwarded internal memo that had my name in the subject line. Can Salas be reinstated temporarily? No greeting, no signature. Just that one line. Dropped into my inbox like a rock into a well. I didn't answer. I wasn't punishing them. I wasn't angry. I just knew what they hadn't realized yet. They weren't asking the system to approve vendors. They were asking it to trust again. And trust doesn't come back on request. I flipped open my notebook, drew a straight line across the page, then wrote one sentence under it. They called the wrong people, and the system knew better. I wasn't watching to see them fail. I was watching to see when someone would finally stop treating trust like a feature. Because it never was. It was the architecture, the whole damn frame. And without it, everything that looks like movement is just noise. If you've ever watched a system fall apart because someone erased the person who built it, click that subscribe button. Not for me, for the ones they forgot to call. It started with a note, handwritten, scanned, attached to a contract amendment from a small vendor in Arizona. No shipment until V. Salas signs again. That was it. No demand, no legal argument, just a sentence scribbled in the margin beside the shipping schedule. Procurement flagged it as unprofessional. Legal called it non-binding. But the vendor didn't care. They weren't negotiating. They were remembering. By the end of the week, 4 other vendors had added similar language to their correspondence. One simply replied to a license reactivation email with, "Who's replacing Victor? Do they know what we build?" Another forwarded an old email chain, my name still in the CC line, highlighting a section where I had personally approved a waiver to save a shipment from being delayed over a misplaced lot number. "He got it," the vendor wrote. "We don't ship blind." At Clearspan, the reaction was scattered. Procurement tried to substitute vendors. Didn't work. The replacements failed basic trace, weren't on the federal pre-clearance list, didn't have the same background certification Victor had personally walked them through. The CTO suggested relaxing standards temporarily. "We need movement. They're holding us hostage over one guy's name." Legal refused. "If we do that, we violate every audit trail tied to defense compliance since 2018. Someone in operations asked the real question. Why are we even in this mess? Why did we let someone like Salas walk without a plan? No one answered. Inside the system, the collapse slowed. Not because it was fixed, but because it had fully locked down. No vendors approved, no shipments moving. The machine was no longer confused. It had chosen to wait. I saw it unfold from my usual place, an old laptop on the kitchen table. Black coffee, open ledger. I watched the error logs roll in. Watched the attempts at override get flagged. Saw one particularly desperate attempt to reroute vendor authentication through a shadow protocol. The system caught it. Unauthorized escalation. Trace tampering detected. Access revoked. Session terminated. At the bottom of the audit log, a single vendor response had been indexed automatically. Vendor feedback logged bring back Salas. The system didn't flag it, didn't reject it. It just acknowledged it. I flipped to a fresh page in my notebook. Wrote down 5 names, all vendors I'd worked with, all now frozen. Next to each I wrote the same phrase. Trusted the system because they trusted a person. What ClearSpan hadn't understood, what most companies never understand, is that compliance isn't enforced from above. It's upheld from below, by vendors, by people, by the quiet decision to do things right, because someone on the other end is paying attention. They tried to call me again. This time a message from someone in legal. Polite, careful. Would you be open to consulting just to clarify clause transition points? I didn't respond. Not because I wanted to punish them, because I needed them to see this wasn't about me. It was about what they chose not to know. Inside ClearSpan, people began printing out logs, highlighting red flags, pasting error codes into Slack channels. Someone posted a message that said, "Is there anyone who understands how this was built?" The answer, of course, was yes, but they weren't ready to ask the right question yet. Because when a system loses trust, it doesn't ask for rescue, it waits. And when vendors stop replying with documents and start replying with memories, that's not a negotiation. That's a reckoning. It didn't crash. It didn't scream or lock anyone out with a dramatic pop-up. The system just went quiet. The usual daily pings, vendor verifications, license validations, threshold approvals stopped showing up in dashboards. No errors, no alerts, just absence, like a breath being held. Slack threads filled with screenshots. Teams asking each other if they'd seen the same missing columns. Someone posted a screenshot of a live trace run. Trace chain detected. Authority null. Sala's legacy verified status awaiting trust restoration. No one knew what that meant, but everyone knew who it pointed to. They didn't say my name in meetings. Not directly. They referred to the legacy handler or the prior authority, but it hovered under every sentence, like a shadow on the edge of the frame. A junior engineer, Connor, maybe 25, was the first to write it out. He'd been combing through the diagnostic audit logs when he found a piece of code buried deep in the vendor trust logic. A variable, not a username, not a credential, just Salas trust weight sure 1.0. He stood up during a status meeting, walked to the whiteboard and wrote, "Trust wasn't a value, it was a variable." No one spoke for a moment. Then someone in procurement quietly said, "So that's what the vendors meant." The blame game started soon after. Legal accused operations of failing to safeguard chain continuity. Operations blamed compliance for not training successors. Compliance blamed leadership for removing the only person who knew the system by heart. Someone asked if it was illegal to re-sign Victor's name just to unfreeze the trace chain. Legal didn't answer. Not because they didn't know, because they did. An emergency board meeting was scheduled for the following Monday. But inside the company, the urgency had shifted. They weren't trying to fix the system anymore. They were trying to understand how they broke it. Meanwhile, the vendors kept replying. Not with invoices, with silence, with attachments that never opened, with messages like, "Still waiting on legacy verification. Call Victor. We're not moving otherwise." They weren't being stubborn. They were being consistent. At my place, I added a new section to the notebook, labeled it Passive System Response. Under it, I copied one entry from a log I hadn't seen before. System behavior adjustment, redundant credentials declined. Root cause confidence collapse. I hadn't written that line. The system did. It wasn't making a threat. It was making a point. They thought the trace chain was code. It wasn't. It was memory. Hundreds of approvals, each with intent behind them. Each one a handshake, a trust marker. You can't overwrite that with admin access. You have to earn it, one decision at a time. That night, someone from the vendor council finally reached out. An old contact. Didn't leave a name. Just a subject line we didn't forget. No body text, no signature. I didn't reply, didn't need to, because some systems don't need commands. They need acknowledgement. I watched the internal slides from the board meeting get leaked 2 days later. There, in the bottom corner of slide 9, was a chart, titled, Vendor Retention Drop-Off Post-Salas. Beneath it in small gray text, Recommendation Reinstate Authority, if possible. They still weren't saying it directly. But the system had already answered. Authority not found. And the vendors, they were done explaining. The message came through a vendor. Not a VP, not legal, not even compliance. Just a quiet forward from a mid-tier supplier I used to walk through quarterly reviews with. Clearspan would like to open a dialogue. That was the phrase. Not an apology, not a request. Just an opening. I didn't reply right away. Instead, I flipped back in my notebook to the day it happened. Not the technical day, the real one. It was a Tuesday, 9:14 a.m. I'd been called to a leadership recalibration meeting. No calendar invite, no agenda. Just a folded piece of paper handed to me by a project manager with shaky hands. Inside it read, "We thank you for your service and vision. The team is heading in a new direction." That was it. No eye contact, no explanation. Just a printed letter in a silence so tight it hummed. I remember placing my badge on the table, lining it up perfectly with the logo at the top of the paper. Then I walked out. I didn't speak to anyone that day, not even my vendors. What would I have said? That trust was now a memory. That legacy was just paperwork without a name to anchor it. They wouldn't have believed me then. But now, they were living the echo. I opened my laptop, pulled up a copy of the last slide deck I ever sent to Clearspan's leadership. It was titled, "Trust as a Layer, Not a Checkbox." Slide 4 had a diagram, 3 concentric rings. Compliance, continuity, credibility. At the center, a name. Not mine. Just a placeholder designated steward. I had submitted it to the board 1 week before my removal. It got 0 replies. Now their system was asking for exactly what that slide had warned them about. Authority not found. And the vendors were doing the same. Not demanding money, not escalation, just holding firm, waiting for the steward to return. I opened a new email, typed out a single line. No greeting, no signature. Clause 4.7, reinstated with my name, or nothing moves. Then I hit send. Clause 4.7 wasn't a trap. It wasn't even mine originally. It was a failsafe written years ago, buried deep in the vendor continuity protocol. I hadn't invented it, I just honored it. And when they removed my credentials, they stripped the clause of meaning. Now they wanted it back. I checked the audit log. The system had already picked up my name again. Not through direct access, through trace residuals, my approvals, my pattern signatures, the small choices that together built a path of trust. The log now read, "Pending signature, M. Salas, status incomplete." It wasn't poetic, wasn't dramatic, just accurate. The system hadn't failed. It was doing what it was designed to do. Wait for the right signature. I stared at the screen a long time. Then I wrote a single line at the bottom of my notebook. The first emotional line I'd allowed myself since this began. They didn't just erase me from the system. They erased the part that worked. The call came on a Monday, 9:0 a.m. sharp. Not a calendar invite, not a forwarded email. A direct number, unfamiliar area code, but I knew. "Mr. Salas," the voice said. That was new. They used my name. Not former officer, not vendor contact, not legacy compliance, just Mr. Salas. I let the silence stretch. Then yes. "We'd like to move forward," the voice said. "On reinstatement. Clause 4.7. I waited. People who speak first in these calls lose the shape of their leverage. They know that. I know that. Eventually they added, "Would you be willing to authorize the re-signing?" I didn't smile. I didn't even breathe deeply. Just said I'll come in. I brought nothing. No briefcase, no laptop, no copies. They'd brought too many copies the first time. All those printouts, none of them useful. The building hadn't changed. Same lobby with polished stone. Same neutral artwork meant to offend no one. Same conference room. Same glass walls. Same quiet hum of fluorescent authority. There were 4 people seated when I walked in. Legal, operations, CTO, and someone new, probably their crisis negotiator in a tailored suit. No one stood, but one nodded. I pulled out a chair and sat. On the table, a thick document, tabbed, annotated, color-coded. Clause 4.7 was page 84. They pushed it toward me. I didn't touch it. "Who signs at this time?" I asked. They hesitated. The operations lead cleared her throat. Then softly, "You do." I looked at the document. Not for the language. I wrote most of it. What mattered was what wasn't written. Intent, tone, ownership. "I'll sign," I said. But I'll amend one line. They all looked up. I took a pen, crossed out the generic steward field. Then I wrote, Steward M. Salas with Revocation Watch. They looked at each other, but no one objected. The CTO almost nodded. I initialed the margin, signed the footer. Date, time, done. We didn't shake hands, no closing statements. I slid the document back, stood, turned to leave. At the door, I paused, then said, Trust isn't reset with paper. It's rebuilt by what happens after. And I walked out. By the time I got home, the system had already updated. I didn't need access. The logs were public enough. At 11:17 a.m., ClearSpan's vendor dashboard refreshed with new metadata. Authority restored. M. Salas status watcher. Not admin, not owner. Watcher. Because this time I wasn't here to rebuild it for them. I was here to make sure they wouldn't destroy it again. The system came back online. Not with a launch event, not with a press release. Just a quiet green status light on every vendor terminal that used to blink red. One by one the nodes stabilized. Authentication chains linked. Licenses cleared. No more error messages. No more calls from frustrated vendors. No more unknown steward flags. Just order. They didn't announce my return. Didn't even update the org chart. Because technically I never came back. But the logs told the story. Every time a vendor accessed the backend, the footer read, Authority verified. M. Salas. Status watcher. Some of them noticed. I know because a few emailed. Welcome back, Mr. Salas. Good to see the signature again. We trust it now. I didn't reply. Just moved those emails into a folder called Proof. At 2:13 p.m. on a Thursday, someone from engineering pushed a minor patch to the permissions layer. In the code comments, they found an old line. Steward active. Leave as is. They didn't understand it. Didn't trace the author. But they didn't touch it. The thing about trust is that once it's lost, people start reading the quiet parts. I didn't return to the building. I didn't accept the advisory seat they quietly floated. Didn't join the compliance meetings they started adding my name to. Didn't even answer the call when legal asked if I'd consider closing the loop with a brief statement. I wasn't being rude. I just had already done enough talking. Now it was their turn to prove they'd learned something. And besides, the system spoke louder than I could. It rejected shortcuts. Logged every override attempt. Alerted vendors when access felt too easy. It wasn't paranoia, it was memory. They wanted a future-proof system. Well, now they had one. One that remembered who didn't blink when things got hard. One afternoon I passed by the building. Not on purpose, just my route took me there. The lights were on. The badge readers blinked. The people inside still wore their lanyards and optimism. None of them saw me. I stood outside for a moment. Watched the reflection of the entryway in the rain-slicked pavement. It looked clean. Not pure, not fixed, but aware. That's all I ever wanted. Not control, not revenge, just awareness. The system has it now, and that's enough. The system didn't crash again. Not because of luck, not because they got better, but because it had memory now. And memory, when built, right knows what not to allow. They never publicly mentioned me. No LinkedIn posts, no thanks for your service. But that was fine. I wasn't doing this for closure. I was doing it so no one else had to start from scratch. 2 weeks after Clause 4.7 was reinstated, I checked the back-end logs one last time, just out of habit. The system was stable. Uptime metrics were clean. Vendor complaints dropped to 0. And at the bottom of the maintenance report in small gray font, last reviewed M. Salas, silent mode. I didn't add that, but someone kept it. They knew. That same day I got an email from a new vendor. Didn't know her. She just onboarded her company last quarter. The subject line said, "Thank you for not disappearing." No emojis, no signature quote, just a few lines. We heard stories about a guy who held the whole network together when nobody else cared. Didn't believe it until we saw the system run like it remembered who built it. If that was you, thank you. Just thank you. I didn't respond, just archived it in the same folder Proof. Sometimes I wonder how many people it takes to keep something honest. Maybe just one, but not one who talks loud. One who watches quietly, and stays even when no one's watching back. The headquarters eventually changed names. New leadership, new signage. Same building, same servers. Different fear, not of collapse, but of being seen. Because now every override logs a warning. Every shortcut leaves a trace. I walk by that building once a month. Never go inside. Never need to. I don't check the logs much anymore, but sometimes I do. And every time I see that line, Stewardum Salis, status watcher, I know they haven't forgotten, and neither has the system. That was always the goal. Not revenge, not applause, just not being erased. If you've ever seen someone like that, someone who held it all together but was treated like they didn't matter, hit the subscribe button. This story was for them.